Okay guys, so welcome to lesson 10.2. This is our second lesson here in chapter 10. If you take a look at the schedule that I posted in Google Classroom, we are actually doing lesson 10.1 day 1, then lesson 10.2, which is today's lesson, and then the next lesson we go back to 10.1 day 2. The content just worked out best that way, so that's why we do 10.1, jump to 10.2, and then go back to 10.1. So let's take a look here at 10.2, which is focused on solving equations by using square roots. And here when we're talking about square roots, we're going to be seeing equations that look like this: x squared equals 9. And so when we are trying to find the solution, remember when we see that word solve or solution, that means that there's going to be an equal sign involved in the answer. Okay, and when we're asked to find the solution to x squared equals 9, what we want to be thinking is what number multiplied by itself equals 9. All right, hopefully some of you guys came up with 3, okay, because 3 times 3 equals 9, the same exact number multiplied by itself, but there's actually a second answer. So even though my first answer is x equals 3, I'm going to give you a second here and see if you can think of the second answer. And my other option is actually -3 times -3, because a negative times a negative also gives you a positive. So I would have two answers to this: x equals 3 and x equals -3. Notice that -3 times +3 does not work. It gives us -9. Okay, when we are trying to find a square root, what number multiplied by itself equals 9, it has to be the same exact number, even the signs have to be identical. Here, talking about square roots, I want you all to take a look that x squared and the square root of x are opposite operations. So just how when we have addition and subtraction, those are opposite operations, multiplication and division are opposite operations, that's the same way where x squared and the square root of x are opposite operations. So when we're dealing with equations, they are going to undo each other. So a square root, as you see here, is a number that is multiplied by itself. So 3 was the square root of 9 because you do 3 times 3 to get 9. Now a square root can be positive or negative. There's not a restriction on that. And so notice how we can write it. On the last slide, we saw that the square root of 9 was 3 and -3. You can write it here joined as plus or -3. So instead of separating them and telling me -3 and 3, you can just combine them here in 1. And so that is notation that you'll definitely see moving forward just in your high school and college math career. Sometimes, however, including today in one of our word problems, you'll see that you're only asked for the main square root, okay? And whenever you're asked for the principal square root or the main square root, we're always talking about the positive number. And for example, even in your calculator, if you take the square root of 9 in your calculator only tells you 3 because that's the principal square root. So you guys need to make sure, again, you are smarter than your calculator. You are the one that tells your calculator what to do. So when you put square root of 9 in the calculator and it just tells you 3, you need to know, okay, well, I'm smart enough. I know that the answer is also -3. Okay, please remember that for your quiz and for your test. So unless they say only tell me the main square root, make sure you always give me both. Now the reason why a principal square root comes into play is because sometimes a negative number doesn't make sense for the problem. This is particularly true in word problems. For example, if I ask you to solve how far a car went. Okay, I guess that's actually a bad example because a car could go negative distance and go backwards. But how high you threw a ball. Okay, you can't throw a ball down below the ground, so that wouldn't work. So that's an example of when a positive square root would be the only option because you can only have a positive number.
Okay, we're that.
All right, let's take a look at just some examples here with solving with square roots. And my first example is just x squared equals 25. I know some of you may be able to do this in your head, but please make sure that we're showing work and that you know the steps for solving. Because as the equations get more difficult, you're gonna have to make sure you follow your steps. So in order to get the x alone, remember that's our goal when we're solving equations, we want to get that x alone. So in order to get the x alone, I'm going to do the opposite operation, which is square root, and if you do it to one side, you have to do it to both. So I square root both sides. Over here on the left, my square root and my square cancel out, so I'm just left with x, and my square root of 25 is 5. So there's my answer. Anyone catch my mistake? And what am I missing, right? That my other square root is -5. Okay, guys? If you only give me 5, you're going to lose half credit on your quiz. All right? You have to make sure you include that negative square root as well. It is totally personal preference if you write it this way separate, or if you put them together and put x equals plus or minus 5. That is personal preference. I will accept either for full credit. Let's go to our second example, and we go ahead and we square root both. Now notice, 10 is not a perfect square. Okay, 25 is because it was 5 times 5. But 10 is not a perfect square. So when you go ahead and you put the square root of 10 into your calculator, you get x equals 3.16. So I'll go ahead and put my box around that. And then remember, I also have negative 3.16. And here I rounded to the 100th decimal place. Okay, usually the 100th is sufficient unless the directions tell you otherwise. For my last example here on this slide, again, I want to get the x alone, so I square root both sides. Even though it is a fraction, we're going to square root the same way. Okay, so over here on the left, my square root and my square cancel out, so I get x equals, now look at my two numbers. They are both perfect squares, so almost treat them separately. Just take the square root of 9, which is 3, and take the square root of 4, which is 2, and there's my answer. X equals 3 over 2, and x equals -3 over 2. Remember, when your problem in math has a fraction, then you want to keep your answer as a fraction. So that's why I wrote 3 over 2 instead of 1.5. Now let's look at a slightly more complicated equation. Okay, still here solving with square roots. But something to keep in mind as our equations get more difficult is that you always want to undo the square root last. Remember, when we're solving equations, we always see what we can add or subtract first, then what we can multiply or divide, and then the last thing that we're going to want to do is undo that square root, the square or the square root. So how do we solve the following equation? Remember, the goal in solving any equation is to get the variable alone. So here I have my x, and I want to get it alone. Now, there is nothing on the left side of the equation with the x that I can add or subtract. So I know that I'm not going to be adding or subtracting. But now I see if there's something that I can multiply or divide. So if I have 4x squared, remember the invisible operation here is times. So if it's 4 times x squared, the opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4, and now I have x squared equals 25. And so now in order to solve, to get rid of that squared, the opposite operation is a square root. So I square root both sides. I get x equals 5. And then don't forget my second answer as well, x equals -5. Let's take a look now at a word problem that I believe may be our last example for this PowerPoint. This is a nice short lesson. So solve the following equation to find the exact time that it takes for an object to fall from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. All right, so again, let's start here. Remember, our goal is to get our variable alone. So look on that left side. I want to get t alone. And I always see, is there anything that I can add or subtract first? That's what I always want to do first. And the answer is yes. There is something that I can add or subtract. What I can add or subtract is that 185. Since it's a plus 185, the opposite operation is minus 185. If I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other side. Here they cross out, so I am just left with negative 16 t squared equals negative 185. So from here, now that I've added or subtracted, now I'm going to see if there's anything that I can multiply or divide. And so let's take a look. And remember this negative 16 t squared, there's an invisible multiplication there. So if it's negative 16 times t squared, I'm going to do the opposite operation, which is to divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 16. The negative 16s cross out on the left-hand side. And then when I do negative 185 divided by negative 16, I get t squared equals 11.5625. And that decimal terminates after those 4. So if you have a decimal that does terminate, write it all the way out, okay? If the decimal ends, put all 4 of those digits, that way you have them. Don't round until your very final step. So now that I have that, I still need to get my t alone. So the opposite of t squared is to square root. So when I square root my 11.5625, I end up with t equals 3.4. I'm just rounding here to the 10th because I really got 3.400367. Okay, and so rounding here to the 10th would be sufficient because then I just am followed by a 0. So t equals 3.4. So what is that telling me since this is a word problem? Find the exact time that it takes. So the time would be 3.4. They don't tell us the units, but it means that it takes 3.4 seconds, 3.4 minutes, depending what that unit would be. Now, here is an example where my negative answer would not work. Now, why would this not work? Because if I'm dropping an object, it can't take a negative amount of time to hit the ground. So that's why in this example, my negative answer doesn't work, only my positive answer, but unless it's a word problem, make sure you include both. So let's take a look here at one more equation that is not a word problem. And here we have x minus 2 in parentheses squared minus 9 equals 0. And just a little reminder for you guys, remember that when you solve for your x, you are finding the zeros. And that terminology you'll see used really often, even in the next lesson and throughout the chapter. So I want you guys to start getting used to that. So the first thing we do, remember, I want to get the x alone, but we see if there's anything that we can add or subtract. So the first thing that I can do is I can add 9 to both sides. So when I do that, I'm left with x minus 2 squared equals 9. Now, this is a tricky part that throws off a lot of people, okay? This x minus 2, because it's in parentheses, they're glued together. We can't separate them until the very end, okay? Normally, we would do the square root last, but because of that parentheses, the x minus 2 is glued together and we can't just separate it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and actually get rid of that square root first. So let me put my parentheses back. And so what I'm going to do is get rid of my square first. So let's square root both sides over here on the left. The square and the square root cancel out. Now this is what's really tricky. I'm left with x minus 2 equals 3. But we should all know that the square root of 9 is not just 3. What's my other square root of 9? X minus 2 equals negative 3. So notice how this one equation has broken up into 2 parts. So I'm going to end up with 2 final answers. Please be very mindful of this. This is a very common mistake that all sorts of people make, not just in Algebra 1, even some of my college algebra students still forget to set up this second equation. Okay, so we need to do x minus 2 equals 3 and x minus 2 equals negative 3. Now we're just going to solve each equation normally and get 2 answers. On my first one, I add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 5. On my second one, I add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals negative 1. So there are my 2 final answers. And remember, how could you check your work if you wanted to? You could plug these back in to the original equation. So if I took this x equals 5, and let me erase a little bit here at the top. So if I took that 5 and I plugged it up here at the top, right? If I got x equals 5, I should be able to plug 5 in, and my answer should be 0. So let's test that out here really quickly. 5 minus 2 squared minus 9. 5 minus 2 is 3. So I have 3 squared minus 9, 9 minus 9, and that does give me 0. Okay, guys, so keep that in mind whenever we're solving equations. You can always check your work by plugging it back in. And there we go. That is our lesson for 10.2. Here is our homework. You can find this on Google Classroom. You have these 12 questions. Please make sure you read the directions carefully. For example, here in numbers 3 through 6, they are asking for both square roots and making sure we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, so to 2 decimal places when necessary. And then for this bottom section, 7 through 12, again, solve each equation, round answers. So again, we are looking for both answers. You should have 2 answers for each of these. And if you need to round, rounding to the nearest hundredth, so to 2 decimal places. Okay? Remember, for a complicated problem like number 10, always add or subtract first. Okay, remember that our little x minus 5 is glued together in that parentheses. Let me know if we have any questions, guys. Drop those in the Google Classroom so that I can help you out and then also help your classmates out with that as well. So thank you for being here for lesson 10-2, and I will see you guys next time for our next lesson.